Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the channel. I'm joined by Pastor Brian again for another episode
Hello.
of Infernal Intercourse. And today we want to discuss a couple of YouTube videos that we were looking at online. The first one is by Mr. Mythos, and it is about Yahweh being a dragon in the Old Testament. So we want to have a little chat about that before we talk about the second video. So, Brian, your opening comments.
Will you be able to link that below that video,
Yeah.
Mr. Mythos? Yeah. And so I really want to try my best to engage positively Mr. Mythos's theory. It's not biblical in any way, in my opinion, and I think in most biblical scholars. And I remind people that when we're talking about the Hebrew scriptures, of course, the rabbis are the experts, and there's millennia of schools of rabbis. I mean, there may be a rabbi here or there that has a certain theory, but the mainstream of rabbi interpretation would not go along with Mr. Mythos, including the way he interprets a lot of the words. But I think it's also kind of historical revisionism, because I think even he understands that this concept of a dragon that we have in the West later would not have been familiar at all to first century Palestinians or 2500 before the Common Era people in the Mideast there. So I think we just need to remember when we read the Bible that it is the testimony of people from millennia all the way up to at least maybe 300 before the Common Era, at least. And it's finally all written down in one or two clumps, not in the order that we see it. So it's their testimony of their understanding of God. And that's all it is. It was never meant to be some kind of secret lexicon, maybe when we get around to the Gospel of John and maybe Revelation, but other than that, it's not into some secret knowledge. It's just people passing on the treasury of their relationship with God and how they understood it. Every bit as smart as us, every bit as loving and caring as us, but without psychology, without science, without technology, without the ability to instantly know all of recorded history on a computer instantly as we do now. So that's just not how the Bible works. So I do think there's something to the idea of why is it that humans sense this beast, this some kind of demonic or evil or accuser or opposer, but especially something that's more bestial. I mean, it kind of makes sense if we start thinking about more primitive humans. But so, of course, when they encountered things that were unexplainable, that was God to them.
I think what people don't remember a lot is that we're syncretizing a lot of different centuries, a lot of different people. I remember one of the things I read on ancient Egypt, ancient Egypt was divided into nomes. They're kind of like states. And people didn't really move far from home, right? So these two nomes were right next to each other, and one of them worshipped a kind of dog, and the other one worshipped, I think, a kind of fish. And at some point, the people in one nome discovered that the people in the other nome were eating their sacred fish, and they kind of went to war over it. These are next door neighbors, right? And yet, if you read a book from a bookstore, it's going to say, well, in ancient Egypt, they believe, blah, blah, blah. It was like, well, which nome, which century, which, there's going to be hundreds of different choruses and thousands of different interpretations of everything, because everything was local to most people. When we say the Egyptians believe, we're talking about the state religion, and only the people at the top had any idea what was going on there. And the same thing with Norse mythology. You're like, here's Norse mythology. Well, that's ancient Scandinavians, ancient Germans, and different centuries and different times. And maybe this group over here had a thing for Odin, and this group over here had a thing for Tyr. But looking at it from our end, we just say, oh, it's all Norse mythology. But that's only after you compile it and have to try to fit it all together into some kind of puzzle. It was never meant to be,
a lot of it compiled by Christians, right? Recording it from their context too. So
Right. I mean, if you read Beowulf, right, every so often the author drops in things like because Christ is good, or because he followed Christ, or and it's like none of the characters are Christians, but the author can't help but drop a few things in there, right? So you're looking at things, and even when people say, "Oh, this is what the Celts believe," we know the Celts didn't write things down, so that's what people 1,000 years later compiled and thought the Celts believed. And maybe they're right, but that's a long time to not, to be guessing and to not belong to that culture or speak those languages or have that religion. So from our end of history, it looks neat because we compile it to make it look neat, but it's not really neat. It's a mess.
I mean, there certainly was oral tradition that was handed on more intact than we probably would expect, but it certainly changed per teller, right? And I forget that study, you probably know it, of the person who studied kind of untouched by Western culture tribes that were all oral, and even as they recorded over time, just within that small little group, their stories change to fit the context. The storyteller, of course, changes depend on who's listening and stuff to make it, they're passing on certain ideas, but they're not verbatim for sure.
The oral history changes quite frequently. Yeah.
Yeah. And our copies of all the written text show that there, all kinds of redactions and changes and mistakes and everything else.
Yeah, right down to spelling mistakes. I did read an article on a group of people who believe that their oral history is like absolutely the same forever. And so when anthropologists go back and they say, well, here's the recording of you singing this song in 1960, and here's the recording of you singing it last night, they're not the same. They will still insist it's the same. I mean, they obviously can hear that it's different, but the cultural expectation is that nothing ever changes in the oral history, even though it changes all the time. So yeah, when people say, well, that's an oral history, it goes back centuries. Not really.
Just like our friend in the refutation video that I don't know if we mentioned, but he starts by saying, well, the Bible is complete and total and everything. It's like, no, sorry, that's not how it works, bro.
Yeah. Okay, so some of the things that should prove that Yahweh is a dragon include some verses that imply that it has a long nose, that it eats virgins, lives in a mountain, has wings and flies, breathes fire, is a physical being that lives in the mountain, and likes copper and other precious metals a lot, and has smoke coming from its nose. So those are a few of the things that Mr. Mythos is pulling out of some text to indicate that the understanding of Yahweh is that it should be some kind of fire-breathing creature who lives in a mountain and hoards metal, i.e. a dragon, of later Western idea of a dragon anyway.
So, well, we can start with nose. I mean, he's onto something. It's true. So first of all, Hebrew is very, it's definitely the hardest thing I ever studied in my life. It was maddening, and I was barely proficient, right? Like, I had a teacher who was a freaking genius. But I mean, it was really, really difficult, and it's 3-letter roots. And then, we're used to thinking, well, the root word typically stays intact, but that's not true with Hebrew always, right? So the prefixes and the suffixes can literally change the complete meaning. So it is true that nose and rage kind of come together. And my professor really thought, and I've heard lots of rabbis say, because again, remember, they're the experts on Hebrew and on the Hebrew scriptures, that, it makes sense because flare nostrils and huff and puff and things like that. So nose and that anger and all that, I don't know where he gets this elongated snout, it's really, really reaching, but so that's a typical example, though, of people who are looking for all this hidden stuff, because they just pick a thing here and then they add to it, and then they cherry pick something from somewhere else. And the language is the language, and maybe we've got it wrong, but I doubt that we have it wrong and that he all of a sudden guessed it just right in his extrapolation. So I don't know where he nose, yes, a long dragon snout. First of all, again, that wasn't familiar. Maybe alligators or something. I don't know. Well, what do they have? Crocodiles over there?
Crocodiles.
Yeah. But I do love, though, the idea of breathing fire. So again, I immediately think whenever you hear in Exodus about Mount Sinai, it's covered in cloud, and we hear that a lot, right, through all of Exodus. Fire, a pillar of fire and a cloud. Yeah, there's fire and there's clouds, but there's no beast there breathing it. So you can go through the Bible. There are many metaphors for God, certainly, and people experienced unexplainable, terrifying things, and to them that would have been God. But very, very seldom is, especially Yahweh, talked about in a context of a beast. I differ with him on trying to put those pieces from different parts together, because again, that's not how it works. And the Bible's not like one continuous scroll, especially in the order that we have it. So they were all written down at different times, stories from different times. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So he also then discusses a couple of other dragons or dragon-like things like Quetzalcoatl in the Aztecs. Certainly flying serpents seem to show up in ancient Egypt, which just might indicate that people have a fascination with snakes, something that crawls on the ground. It doesn't have arms or legs, doesn't have eyelids, right? So they're always staring. So they're pretty creepy. A friend of mine has the 2-4 rule. He says that the farther away something gets from like 2 eyes and 4 limbs, the weirder we think it is, or the more nervous they make us. So like, spiders and things that have lots of legs and lots of eyes would freak us out. And here's this animal that seems to have no legs, and it's just, this odd animal that people have been fascinated by. So certainly it seems like people have always picked on snakes and snake-like things to if not worship, at least put in their folklore, I guess. So we're looking at dragons as sort of like these weird serpents. This it makes some sense that people have this fascination for that.
Yeah. And I mean, that's where I try and meet this band's imagination, is where I think there must be something in human imagination, right? That this kind of a serpent, kind of a fire terror. He used the word Leviathan. That's a translation word, but great fish, I think in Hebrew is, if we think of Jonah. But and I could be wrong, but it wasn't this idea of this terrifying. Well, I guess it was terrifying, but not God. Mm-hmm. Like the fish who swallows Jonah is a tool of God to do God's business, right? And there's a great passage in Jonah. It's one of the books we translated in Hebrew class. So there's a great passage in Jonah where when the fish takes him down and he's freaking out, and you get, again, very, very similar to Job, this whole thing about the foundations of the universe, and and how deep he is, and all the things that he can see about kind of creation and all that kind of thing. And it's very much, the fish is like almost like an angel, right? Messenger. Like the fish is kind of doing, picks up Jonah and returns Jonah to where Jonah's supposed to be, and on the way the fish carries Jonah through this period of enlightenment and purification, right? Like, so I don't feel like that fits this idea that we're talking about with serpents and fire and stuff. Mm-hmm. That seems to have, of course, it held the human imagination, because they didn't have a scientific explanation for it. And so, they're wondering why God puts these things in the world. But again, especially to Judaism, even though we've talked about the fact that most of the Hebrew scriptures do not really identify one God, right? But several gods, and my God's better than your God, or whatever. My God's more powerful. That's the whole Elijah story. But yeah, fire, lightning, thunder, smoke, serpents. Yeah, there's a lot of that in the Bible. So, and like you said, it goes way beyond. just this particular culture, or even Mideastern culture. It's very interesting.
Okay, so we can perhaps move on to the debunking video, which was put out by, I don't know his name, Total Victory Christian Ministry is the channel, and he has fewer subs than I do. So I have a little channel here on YouTube. His is even microier, but he's got a lot of videos on it, so he definitely has a lot of opinions. Some of them I looked at the titles and thought I might have to watch them. I'm sure I won't agree with anything he has to say, but he is interesting, and he kind of reminded me of the videos I've seen with like flat earthers, because they don't seem to have like counter arguments to a lot of stuff. It's just, I don't like this, right? So the first couple minutes of his debunking video about Mr. Mythos are like, it's total flipping nonsense. I wrote some of this down. Absolute blasphemy.
Yeah, the blasphemy line cracked me up. I was like,
crackpot nonsense came up twice. And then he's talking about my strong knowledge of the occult makes him better than Mr. Mythos, I guess. Horrible blasphemy was another good phrase. And then he wouldn't say the F word. He had to say total flipping nonsense, but he did say bullshit claims. So he has different standards on, I guess, what he considers words he can say on YouTube. So yeah, between it being blasphemy and bullshit and nonsense and crackpot stuff, and he definitely has opinions, but they also aren't really counter arguments. It's just, I think I don't agree with him, right? He's just wrong and I'm just right. So he didn't necessarily have a lot of counterpoint in that way, but and he also said like no one with half a brain would ever I guess listen to Mr. Mythos.
Ad hominem argument.
So yeah, so that was like the first several minutes of his, and then he does take off and quote some other Bible passages, which for him proves that basically everything in the Old Testament, I guess it's not a person, is Satan. So like any dragon you see is a Satan, any other monster you see is Satan. He sees Satan behind every verse basically. Which is, I guess, a favorite thing of some particular preachers.
Which we've discussed how many times that is so like extra biblical, right? Like it's just the least concept that's in scriptures, like
right. I mean, like
barely there.
Hardly a Satan to be found in the Bible, but it's so central to so many of these smaller Christian sects, right? There's Satan everywhere. Well, I had a friend, I'm sure she won't see this, and I won't name her, but many years ago, we were chatting about the Piasa bird, which is, if you're not familiar with the St. Louis area, there's a giant dragon painted on the cliff that was there the first time the Frenchmen went down the river. Marquette and Joliet saw that painted on the cliff because the natives would paint this big dragon that was part of the Piasa bird as part of their mythos. And she's like, well, I'm sure the devil put it up there. And I was like, well, I don't know. I think they could have lowered somebody over the edge of the cliff with a rope. And she's kind of went, oh. It's like, you don't have to jump to Satan as the number one prima facie cause of everything. Could it be Satan? It's like, yeah, this guy's the same way, man. It's just like, okay, it's Satan. First, just that's number one, explanation. You're going to go with guy getting lowered over the edge of the cliff with a rope. That's number 2 or number 10, but number 1, it's right up there, Satan. So first of all, that just kind of like wipes out a lot of any authority you might have, I guess, in any religious context, because Satan, as we said, is barely in the Bible at all. And when it is, it's,
I'm sorry.
And then, well, I'll just say when it is, it's generally getting sent by God. So a tool of God and not some kind of wretched, horrible creature that's slinking up from hell or something.
Yeah. They really both engage in different, but the most common U.S. Christian abuse of scripture. The first one is, the conspiracy theorist, or that he's just like fascinated by this secret idea of like only, you have to like put all these things together, but that's total cherry picking and nonsense and decontextualized. And no legitimate scholar like ever does that. I love, and I think it's Foucault's Pendulum by, what's his name? Who wrote The Name of the Rose? Anyway,
Umberto Eco.
Eco. He has the greatest quote in the world, and he says, like, any crackpot will eventually talk about the Knights Templar. Like that's the first guy. Like he's just gonna put all the pieces together until he connects it to the Knights Templar. But that's so common. Like, and I remember learning all these little obscure things that people didn't know about biblical archaeology or the language and all that stuff. And you do at first, you kind of want to flex it and like show all these people these things they don't know. But ultimately, that's not why it's there, and that's not how it was written, and that's not how it was meant to be done by anybody who wrote it down or studied it for thousands of years, right? It's only our culture that is trying to do that because we have so much knowledge available to us that we like just are used to being able to do that. Like you said, it's synthesizing way too much together all the time. The second guy, he's the other kind of U.S. time. Well, I was taught. Well, that's how I was taught, right? So, and so this is how people told him the Bible worked. And so it just ipso facto is exactly what his daddy told him. And it's like, the fallacies, I don't even know how many fallacies to list in that way of approach, but that is how most fundamental Christians approach the Bible. And that it just is this way. And they'll pick a phrase here or there that they'll often misquote, often quote things that aren't even in the Bible, but they use it to cherry pick to justify whatever it was they were told was how, you're supposed to believe. So yeah, it's like, oh, well, this is the only way because this is how I was taught,
Yeah. Well, one thing I noticed about him is that generally Christians who are into this kind of stuff that what he's doing are literalists. Right? You got to take it all literally. Eden was a real place. There really was a worldwide flood. There really was a Noah and a Jonah and all that kind of stuff. It's all historically accurate. In fact, I think I mentioned to you last time there was even one guy, and right now I can't remember his name, and it's not important, but he's like trying to convince atheists to come to Christianity. And so he's like, well, can you just give me that Genesis 1 and 2 are historically accurate? Can we just at least get that much in an agreement? And they're like, dude, no, that's not.
You picked history. The perfect example of how you can't take it literally. They contradict each other.
So this guy was like, but you can't take it literally. This part is metaphor, and this part's not literal. And you're like, well, okay, so It's all literal except for what you don't want it to be.
Exactly.
And then it's fine for it not to be literal. So
certain parts of Leviticus are literal and then other parts are not, right? Like all of a sudden, so again, they're both, really, really faulty thinking, right? Like it's and almost to the point of cognitive dissonance, right? Mm-hmm. I listened to them, and there wasn't much to look at. So I listened and my ears glazed over, right? Because it's just, you know what I mean? Like, it just, maybe if I had to read it, I would have maybe absorbed a little bit more, but that's why I was grateful that you kind of picked up the points they made, because I was just like, what's the point? You're like, literally, you could say anything, like for both of them, from the logic they're using, but nothing makes me crazier than picking and choosing and then claiming to be, literal. The first guy, at least, he's just like looking for ephemera, right? Like that he then synthesizes. But the second guy, and that's so many U.S. Christians, it's like everything's literal until it's something I disagree with, and then it's not, right? Mm-hmm. Just because God hates everybody I hate and God loves everybody I love, and that's of course. And of course, we're the only ones who will be saved because of where we were born, and this is the dominant culture, but everybody else is Satan, right? Because they weren't born in the United States and raised in a Bible thumping church. That's crazy.
All the right thinking people. Yeah. So definitely he saw Satan everywhere, but then he saw Jesus in the Old Testament in a way I'd never seen Jesus in the Old Testament. Usually it's like, well, if you look, by his stripes we are healed and stuff. There's these things in Isaiah that point to Jesus and like that. But this guy is like, so when God tells Moses to make a big pole and put a copper snake on the top of it and then show it to the Israelites, that's Jesus. And I was like, what would that, what? Wait, Moses has Jesus on a big stick? I mean, I'm not even sure how he got there.
It's a good point for our the human nature of dealing with snakes and stuff, right? But so first, let's just start. It's called supersessionism. No one who shared the stories, wrote down, or interpreted the Hebrew scriptures, again, the rabbis who are the experts now and for millennia, nothing was written down with knowledge of Yeshua of Nazareth from the first century Palestine, right? Like, so now the New Testament will cite all kinds of it because those were the scriptures. So, of course, when Jews are looking at a teacher healer that they ultimately see as the path to God and the leader of their movement, of course they're going to justify it with their scriptures. But even in that, they're not saying that, oh, when they told this story 2,500 years ago, they were foretelling of Jesus of Nazareth, right? And especially like the more you study messianic ideas and things like that, we tend to just think, oh, Jesus, but there were so many messiahs before and after Jesus, and just like that whole Isaiah, first of all, by the time we get to the suffering servant song, I mean, these are people who are in a much later school of Isaiah, writing down in a way that they think is consistent with Isaiah, but again is contextualized for them. I mean, that's not how the Bible works. Yes, it's very enlightening to us to read the Hebrew scriptures because that was Jesus's scriptures, and all the quotes that are written down from Jesus would have been quoting the Hebrew scriptures constantly. Those were his scriptures, and he may have used them to say, hey, this is how I was taught, this is what was handed down to me, this is what I believe, and this is how I know who God is because of what my four ancestors have passed on to me. But yeah, it basically takes all of Judaism and says that it only existed to to tell them about Christianity that Christians got right and the Jews just couldn't get it right. It's offensive.
All right. So, are there any final thoughts you want to give on either one of these guys? I was looking at my notes because I watched them a second time and took some notes to make sure I got some of their points down. But the only other thing I guess that they brought up in both of those that we haven't mentioned too much is that, originally El and Yahweh being different gods. I think we've discussed that before on one of our episodes here of Infernal Intercourse, where it's clear that El is like the supreme deity of the Canaanites and Yahweh is not so much. That he's one of a multitude of like little gods. And the second guy, of course, isn't having it. And it's basically El and Yahweh were always the same God. They're always the one God. They're always the supreme God. And there's never any other way to look at it. So.
Yeah. And again, yeah, I mean, again, you have to constantly remember that these stories were compiled in different bumps and written down at different times and compiled late and connected together. And so, yeah, it keeps changing, what they call it Deuteronomistic. So the idea that like you had two different Bibles that were kind of merged into the Hebrew scriptures, like there are all kinds of theories. I do hear people now debunking the idea that there was one writer who wrote the Yahwistic and the one writer who wrote the Elohim. But instead, it's just as they were marrying together different texts, but who knows?
Well, it's clear they didn't always edit things together very well.
Correct. And I don't, because they didn't care, right? Because again, that's not what they were doing. And that would be my closing point is these guys are smart. These guys love God and love their neighbors and love their group, their community. Or they're trying to. And just stop using the Bible as an idol. That's not how it is meant to work. And there is nothing, not even the Bible, that can box God in. God is mystery. I love to refer to Job because, again, the rabbis go back to it over and over, and that's God's answer to Job. Why did you do this? God says, you just don't understand. You weren't there when I formed the foundation of the universe. Yes, we can interact in your metaphors because that's the only way you can wrap me in your brain. But that does not define me, and your rules and how you look at things does not define God. If you believe in God, then the nature of God's not God if you can tell God how God has to be.
And I think one other point I want to make is that we look at texts differently now, right? If you look at something historical now, you assume that they're writing down the literal historical facts.
Which they're not.
They might be. Well, that's what your assumption is when you're going to a nonfiction book. That someone's done the research and hopefully they've got their bibliography in the back of it. And so you know where they got their data, and you're looking at this as this is fact. That's not the way people wrote in the past. I remember one of the examples I saw when I was researching Sumer was that when those king lists in Sumer, they'd say so-and-so ruled for 2,000 years and so-and-so ruled for 4,000 years. And apparently the idea was that the longer rule you were said to have had was the better king you were. So a really good king might be written, he ruled for like 4,000 years, and that guy wasn't so good. Well, he ruled for like 500 years. But the people writing it down and the people reading it didn't necessarily think that was the literal truth. It meant something else. It was saying something about the king. And we look back and think, they thought somebody lived for 4,000 years? Well, they were idiots, but wasn't the point of writing it down that way. So looking at it through a modern lens too, there are traps that may fall in if you don't kind of get why people wrote down certain things. So if you're looking at this, snake on a pole, and one guy is like, well, this is an idol, so it must be the image of Yahweh, and the other guy is like, well, it's Jesus. I don't know what the dude who wrote that chapter or that verse down, we really thought about the snake on a pole, but I wouldn't bet anybody, either Mr. Mythos or the guy doing the Christian ministry page, have it straight.
Well, and certainly, originally whoever told that story, which, we think the Exodus is probably mostly mythological and, nowadays. But the idea that, whoever told that story first, everybody was waiting because they're like, well, of course, how are you going to deal with that? Of course, you put a snake on a stick and hold, what I mean? Because that was just how they dealt with things in their context and in their understanding of the universe. And then ultimately, we lose that context of understanding how and why they thought that. And so now we create magical thinking to try and understand it and synthesize it to something else somewhere else. It's weird. It's very weird.
All right. Well, I hope you stuck with us to the end on this one and that you enjoyed it. You can always leave comments below if you agree with us or disagree with us. So, hit like and subscribe, or hit dislike and still subscribe. And we'll see you for our next Infernal Intercourse.
Peace. Thank you.